Well, we're gonna get going. I'm Tom Worthington. Welcome everybody. I'm on the board of the Coalition of Refuge Friends and Advocates, and I'm also the regional rep for the Refuge Association in the Midwest region. Welcome aboard. Um, Today we're going to take a close look at the annual refuge budget appropriations process. I mean, this is what we've waited all summer for. Um, it's a deep dive with probably the nation's foremost expert on refuge budgets. Greg Knadel is with us today, and I'll introduce Greg in just a second, but I have a couple of other kind of announcements to make. It's helpful if you enter your name and your affiliation in the chat box. That helps us track who we're reaching with these webinars. And also in the chat box is where you might post any questions you have as the program goes along. And if you have a question for Greg, type it up in the chat box. And at the end, we'll have plenty of time to get to all the questions. A recording of the webinar will be available in the Corfa resources website. That's where most of the webinars are housed. So if you want to go back and refer to something or ask someone else to take a look at it, you'll find them in the Corfa Resource Center. We want to thank the Refuge Association and Corfa for sponsoring these webinars. And if there's a topic that you would like to see us present in a future month, don't hesitate to let us know. Send us a note, put it in the chat. There's many ways to reach us. So, refuge budgets. Greg Knadel comes to us today as our expert, and he's had 30 years of distinguished experience in wildlife conservation. He's from the Southwest, so you know he's honest. He completed his undergraduate and graduate studies at New Mexico State University. Um, and like a typical refuge employee, he went to like a half a dozen refuges in his first 2, 3 years of work as a co-op student, as an intern at Bosque del Apache, Wichita Mountains, COFA in Arizona, a brief stint with the New Mexico Ecological Services Field Station, and Bitter Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. And he was an assistant manager at Sequoia National Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma. And then his career took a turn. He went into the Washington office in the refuge budget shop. Most refuge folks don't aspire to work in the refuge budget shop. Greg is unusual. He did that. And boy, was he terrific. As a field person, he could explain the refuge system to those of us that worked in the field with clarity and with passion and with deep understanding. He worked in the refuge budget office, developing the allocations and the development of the budget for over 5 years. And then in 2003, the refuge centennial year, some people call that the high mark in refuge budgets. He joined the staff of the House Appropriations Committee, where he worked as a professional staff. You got it, Bill. In 2009, he left the House Appropriations Committee and joined the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, where he was vice president. Last year, Greg joined the board of the National Wildlife Refuge Association, and he is with us today to talk to us how refuge budgets are developed in Congress and in the headquarters office, and what are the ways as friends groups we can perhaps influence this process in certain times of the year. So with that, Greg, kind of a long introduction, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tom. And I really appreciate this opportunity. I see a lot of names that I am familiar with. And it's always great to talk about refuges. Been my passion. I first started working at Bitter Lake when I was 17 years old. So refuges is in my blood. Joan, do you want to go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint?
Sure.
Okay. So again, my name is Greg Knadel. Long history with refuges, always been the center of my heart. Since, like I said, I started working that young on a national wildlife refuge, but I had been visiting that particular national wildlife refuge for a long time. Joan, go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we're talking about the federal budget process. it is not always the easiest to figure out. In fact, it's almost never easy to figure out. So I'm trying in this presentation to boil it down to kind of what you need to know, when you need to know it, and how to plug into the process. If we can go to the next slide. So what I'm going to cover in this, and there will be hopefully plenty of time at the end for questions, and happy to follow up on things if needed. But, the timeline for appropriations is vital. I think one of the most important things is when can friends and other citizens influence the process? And because of what's happened for many years now, it's important to understand how it's supposed to work, like the way it should happen, and how it actually works. And I'm going to explain how it's supposed to work first, because that's the only way to frame it to show you what doesn't work. And we'll talk about CRs, omnibuses, shutdowns, what you hear on the news, what you don't hear on the news. But then I want to spend a little bit of time, and I know you guys cover this in other presentations, but to me, it's one of the most important things refuges and refuge friends need to really step up and get better at. And that's communicating with Congress, messaging to House and Senate, targeting specific members, and maybe most importantly is involving the aspects of your community in that messaging and into that approach timeline process, because it's very important. So what's the next? Yeah, next slide. We're going to be talking about spending, government spending, which is a topic that can raise hackles on even the most relaxed person in the room. So no getting political, no, nothing. This is a funny quote that I saw years ago and I just never forgot it. But really the whole appropriations portion of this is going to be talking about government spending. And many people think it's out of control. Some don't. It's a really hot topic. So we'll be careful and go right down the middle. Next slide. So there's a couple of concepts I want to introduce up front that will frame things as we go through the actual appropriations timeline and process. So what is an appropriation and what is an authorization? An authorization is when Congress passes a law and gives the government the authority to allow a program to exist. For the refuge system, it's the Refuge System Improvement Act as amended, and it has an expiration date, and the expiration date comes up and it's got to be renewed. And this framework of having to renew programs, reauthorize programs over time is what gives Congress the ability to take a hard look at programs. Are they always reauthorized when they're supposed to be? No. We may cover that. But in that authorization, it also says, here's how much money you're authorized to spend, no more. And here's how you're authorized to spend it. Whereas the appropriation and the Appropriations Committee, they give the authority for a program or an agency to actually withdraw the funds from the Treasury and spend the money. It's appropriations that make refuges work. Authorizers say, here's how refuges should be. Here's what we see they should be. Appropriations say, here's how much you can write the check for in any given year. A simplistic way of putting it. Next slide. Now, within spending, within the power and money to the government, there's two types of spending, and I did not specifically go into the details of this, but you have mandatory spending, typically called your entitlements. That's spending that when it's authorized, it's automatically appropriated. The Appropriations Committee doesn't have to do anything. That's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, a lot of other programs. There are a few Fish and Wildlife Service programs that are considered mandatory, very few. But the bulk of what we're talking about today, and the bulk of what, when you're thinking about how do I talk about spending to, community or members of Congress, is discretionary. And discretionary spending is what is dictated by the annual appropriations bills. The majority of Fish and Wildlife Service funding is discretionary. So that kind of brings us to the beginning of what is the process. And if next slide. So we're only going to cover two of the five steps of the process. So the steps of the federal budget process, formulation, which is the executive branch. That's the president and his people saying, here's the budget we are going to propose. We're formulating this budget to propose it to Congress. Congressional action, that's the legislative branch, and that's where we'll be talking about the Appropriations Committee and the steps they take and where you might plug in to those steps to be influential. We won't be covering, because it becomes increasingly more complex and frankly boring, to talk about execution, which is the actual writing of the checks and spending the money, which is an accounting exercise of sorts. The audit and review, which both branches of both the executive and the legislative branch does. They both are watching the actual spending that's happening. You rarely hear anything about that because, again, it's not something that makes national news unless there's some really egregious spending that happened that makes the national news. And then there's the judicial branch, which gets involved when there's some serious disagreements. And there's been a handful of pretty big Supreme Court cases that went to the appropriations bills that had passed and checked the balance between what the president could do and what the appropriations bill said they could do. The biggest of which might be if you remember back in Clinton, Congress passed a line item veto, and the Supreme Court said, nope, that is taking legislative branch powers and giving them to the executive branch. So, but we're not going to cover those three just because they become very complex. If somebody in the future really wants to get into those, we can. But really where I think friends and citizens need to plug in is on the first two. So if we can go to the next slide. Now, this is one reason I tried to strip this presentation down to the bare bones, is because there's graphics like this, which are fairly complex. So everything under executive branch action that's on the left, not the far right, on the left, is for budget formulation. So within each agency, the budget proposals are sent. And when I worked in Washington, I would sit and work on the operations and maintenance budget of the refuge system. And we would go back and forth within the leadership of the refuge system and the regions and sometimes individual refuges. And we were negotiating with each other on what should go into the budget. Then it jumped to, okay, we've got our ducks in a row, so to speak. And so we're going to start talking to the Department of Interior. And they're going to do the departmental budget. And they're not just doing it for Fish and Wildlife Service. They're doing it for Bureau of Land Management. They're doing it for U.S. Geological Survey. They're doing it for formerly Minerals Management Service. They're doing it for Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education. So in every one of these boxes of formulation, people are making choices as to the haves and have-nots. And that sounds maybe not so great, but that's what it is. So within Fish and Wildlife Service, we decide, okay, what programs are we going to support? What programs aren't we going to support? And then we make that decision. Somebody in the leadership makes that decision, leadership of Fish and Wildlife Service. Then it goes to the department. Department's got to weigh all those decisions that just came from all those agencies, including agencies that really don't necessarily belong competing with each other. The National Park Service competes with Bureau of Indian Affairs and Fish and Wildlife Service. And so it's the way the departments are set up, they have to then prioritize what they are thinking amongst all the agencies that have made very compelling arguments that Refuges needs 540 million this year, period. That we need that. We're going to die if we don't get that. And so they have to weigh that against all those other priorities. And then they have to send that to the President's Office of Management and Budget, OMB. You occasionally hear a reference to OMB on the news. The Office of Management and Budget is the executive branch taking all those priorities that started out on a refuge and rolled up to a regional office and rolled up to the refuge system headquarters and rolled up to Fish and Wildlife Service director and then rolled into the Department of Interior and now have rolled into the Office of Management Budget. And they have to do that amongst all the spending in the federal government. So they have to prioritize within that. And that process is a huge back and forth negotiation. And there will be a very quick slide later on kind of timing of that because it can get really complex. Bottom line is OMB makes their final decisions and then they do what they call a pass back. And when OMB makes their decisions, they do a pass back. So they send this all the way back to the bottom and it filters all the way back up. And you have one chance to appeal their decision. So you make your appeals. This is why refuge system needs 540 million, period. And OMB makes those decisions. In some cases, the president himself makes those decisions on budget numbers. And that is turned into the final uh, president's budget request. So if you think about Fish and Wildlife Service, Refuge System, all the other agencies in the government, they are all sending up a thick book that shows all the past spending, not all, but previous years' past spending, all the justification for all the changes, all of what they wrote as to why we really, really need this. And that all goes to Congress in the form of the president's budget. And all of those books combined from every agency in the federal government could fill a warehouse. So we're talking enormous amounts of information. So that goes to the legislative branch. Now, the legislative branch takes that information, and I included the budget committee here, which I don't always do. They're relevant or irrelevant depending on the year, mostly irrelevant. But they do the House budget resolution and the Senate budget resolution. What they're doing is they take the president's budget and they say, okay, here's the top line amount of discretionary money we're going to spend. Period. Can't go over that. And that's the 302A is what they call it, based on the budget bill, section 302A. But that's the top line amount of money you can spend. So that gets sent to the appropriations committees, and those committees in the House and the Senate, and there's 12 in each House and Senate. There used to be 13, there's now 12. They then have to do allocations, and the allocation amongst each individual bill is really important because that determines, for instance, the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies bill, which is where refuges are. That top line allocation is how much wiggle room you have within that bill to get the maximum amount for the refuge system. So this is all a little bit inside, maybe a lot inside baseball. So the appropriations subcommittee, they review all that. They do what they call a markup, which is their initial, here's what we're going to fund, here's the levels we're going to fund. That goes then to the appropriations full committee, where they then are allowed to amend, to change, to add, to subtract to that appropriations bill to say, I don't think refuges should get this much money. Or you're only going to give them that amount of money. Okay, I want this language added to say that they should be I want a 2-year review of all refuge system budgets or whatever members of Congress want to specify. That then goes to House and Senate floor action and ideally passes both and then goes to a conference committee. The conference committee, the few last thing, 99% of stuff is solved behind the scenes. The few last things that are still open in conference get solved. The bills get passed by the House and Senate. I don't have on here, but they actually go back for the conference goes back for another House and Senate floor vote. Then it goes to the president who can either sign it or veto it. Again, this is a look at the way it's supposed to work. And if you um, head to the next slide. So what I just showed you is the process for regular appropriations bills. And it's a kind of a streamlined version for supplemental. But the way things are supposed to work is every year, the regular appropriations bills are the president's budget comes over, the House and Senate work on it, they make decisions, and that's supposed to be NW or National Wildlife Refuge System, not NFWF, sorry. Um, those decisions are made, and every year, almost every year, there's what we call supplemental appropriations. And that goes through a similar type process, only much more expedited. And that's when there's a fire, a flood, an economic emergency. There's something where, in addition to the regular appropriations, which run the government, there has to be an add-on because something has happened. Big floods, big fires, hurricanes, those require additional supplemental emergency appropriations. So if you can go to the next slide. So you're going to see this slide repeated here, and I hope it's not too much, but this is the way it's supposed to work. And I can't, in my mind, figure out a way to tell you how it's working now without setting a baseline of how it's supposed to work. And I don't know if anybody can guess when the last time it actually worked for all the bills of Congress to be passed and signed into law by October 1st. Give you a hint. It's more than 30 years. So, well, maybe, yeah, 1997, almost more than 30. 1997 was the last time all appropriate, and in 97 there were 13 bills because defense and military construction were separate bills. So the last time it happened is 97. Why am I teaching you a process that hasn't been used since 1997? Good question. Again, in my mind, the only way to frame it is to put it in this context so that when I start talking about the way it's actually happening now, you have the framework. And so the way this is supposed to work is in January and February, congressional members are sending their funding request, sometimes initiated by friends groups and citizen groups to the Appropriations Committee saying, I want this to be a priority this year. This happens before and after the first Monday in February. And that is the day that the president's budget is supposed to be transmitted to Congress in full. So that first Monday in February is when all of Congress gets to see the president's proposed budget for the first time. Are there leaks before that? Yes. Are there back and forth before that? Yes. But for the most part, that's supposed to be it. Has that happened recently? Again, no. I'm giving you this timeline and then telling you it's not real. So, but that's the way it's supposed to work. And then through February, March, and April, the appropriations committees are taking that budget. In fact, all the committees of Congress, including the Budget Committee, are taking that proposed budget and they're going through it and they're doing budget hearings. And you saw some of those on TV this year, I'm sure. If you even on primetime news, there were some of those budget hearings were televised because they got very heated, mostly because of the personalities involved. So not necessarily the numbers they were talking about, which often happens on the Hill. But so as that president's budget is given to Congress in February, the Appropriations Committee is immediately into it and starts dissecting it. The Budget Committee in Congress, in both houses, is dissecting it and diving into it. And the Budget Committee is supposed to, by April 15th, have reviewed that, done all their hearings that they think they need to have, and set the top line, the budget number for the year. And that's the number that everybody lives or dies by. Does that happen every year? No. When it doesn't happen, the Appropriations Committee works with the leadership to come up with what the top line number is. And then in April and May, typically each of the 12 subcommittees gets their allocation. And every subcommittee, including the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies subcommittee, gets their allocation for that fiscal year. And that allocation dictates everything that happens in their bill. And the allocations are typically different from House to Senate. And so House writes their version in subcommittee, it gets amended in full committee, it goes to the floor, but they write theirs, the Senate writes theirs. They're never exactly the same. They have different priorities based upon different interests, based upon different members of Congress, based upon all kinds of other influences. So that happens supposed to happen that April through June timeframe, and then they do their subcommittee and full committee markups, put the bills on the floor, and vote on those bills in both the House and the Senate. And in the House and the Senate, there are different rules, and that's a whole nother thing I'm not going to go into, but is actually pretty interesting how the House and the Senate separately handle the way they do things. So then typically they do a summer recess, which they're about to go out. I think they're not going out until August 8th this year, but usually it starts late July, goes into the end of August. During that time, the appropriations staff are working behind the scenes trying to figure out as much as they possibly can. That's kind of the mundane, doesn't have to involve members of Congress stuff. Before beginning of September, when Congress comes back, and that's when they're supposed to take, and in that month, they're supposed to get the House and Senate negotiate the allocations between the House and the Senate. So you have a conference allocation. That's what Congress collectively has decided is the number for that particular bill. And then they're supposed to reconcile those and pass the bills off each respective floor, the conference bills off each respective floor, and send them to the president, who signs it by October 1st. Again, hasn't happened since 1997. October 1st is the new fiscal year for the federal government. That's the beginning of the fiscal year. Therefore, that's why it's supposed to happen. And in a perfect year, the appropriations committees and Congress members and everybody else spends October, November, December doing oversight, looking at how things were spent, looking at new programs that may be coming, et cetera. So if you could go to the next slide. Here's the important thing, and this is where I want friends groups and citizens and others to really think about this. There are times to plug into this process, as complex and as boring as it is. There are times to plug in. And one of the best times, if we start on the right, is communicating with members of Congress and their staff on your refuge programs. What is happening on your refuge? What is needs to happen? What isn't happening that should be? Communicate with members of Congress on those refuge programs. And then when, before and after the president presents a budget to Congress, again, communicate with members of Congress on those specific programs. Talk to their staff. Talk to their, the local offices. Talk to the state offices for those members. Call the Washington office for those members. That's what they're there for. They're there to hear from you. And the way I describe it is you want to really be almost annoying. I'm saying one level below being a true pest. So not quite super annoying, but just don't let them forget about you. Don't let them forget about that refuge. Don't let them forget about what that refuge means to the community. Because that's the baseline. That's the baseline for everything is what does that National Wildlife Refuge mean? What does it give everybody that contacts it? So there's a few more specifics if we can go to the next slide. So there's a back one. There's a couple of things that are really important that you can do. One is look in February and keep looking into early March on each subcommittee's website, House and Senate, on the Appropriations Committee's websites, House and Senate, and look for when written testimony is due. They all accept written testimony, or at least this year, they were still all accepting written testimony. In a lot of previous years, they used to allow what they called Public Witness Day, where anybody could make an appointment and come in and testify in front of the subcommittee on appropriations on what you think the priority should be, how important your refuge is, how important wildlife conservation is, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not happened. I think now all subcommittees have shut that down. The Interior and Appropriation, that's the one I worked for when I was there. We tried to keep it going, and I think since they've shut it down in the last few years, so there's no more public witness, but you can submit written testimony. And what you can do is follow the process. And I'm about to show you that. Follow the process and communicate with Congress. If the House marks a number that's too low for refuges, don't just tell them that's not enough money. Tell them here's what your community is going to go without. We're not going to be able to do these education programs. We're going to have to get rid of more staff. We don't have staff to begin with. We're going to have to go into the negative on staff. So you can communicate those things based upon the specifics that they're marking up on that time. And if we can go to the next slide. If you want to track exactly what's happening and when it's happening, plus or minus a day, it usually takes them a day or two sometimes to post this, but the congress.gov appropriation status table, which is at this website, and if you look down below, you can see appropriations bills, agriculture, gives you the House vote, the House, the date it was passed by full committee and subcommittee, and it gives you the House report, which is you have a bill and you have a report. The bill is the legal language that outlines the numbers. The report is the committee telling you this is the way we expect you to spend all this money. And it can be very detailed, can be extremely detailed. The report doesn't have necessarily the force of law, but most agencies and most people within agencies are smart enough to know if we don't do what they're telling us to do, they're not going to be very happy. Which means that number, top line number in the bill language, which is the number that we're funded for, may change. But this is a site to go and you can track every bill, And I abbreviated this just to show you ag and interior environment. Ag because it's the first bill in the list, and because it's the only one that's passed the House floor. Of all 12 bills, we're in late July. That's the only one that's been on the House floor. The interior bill has gone through full committee, so those numbers are set. And if you want to read the details of what they said for national wildlife refuges, and that's important, click on that H report 119-687. That will, you can read through the fish and wildlife section of that, and it will tell you exactly what the committee is thinking about all these things. And I think in this year's instance, some of it is about the opening of new opportunities for hunting and fishing on refuges. There's language in the bill about that, or in the report. So this is where you go if you want to track what's happening. And if you track what's happening, that gives you the knowledge and ability to then call up a congressional staffer in the local office or in the state or even the DC office and say, hey, I don't understand it. What's going on? We should have more than this, or this is not gonna this is gonna cause this, and this to happen at my refuge. Um, so next slide. I just threw this in to give you just, I know I've shown you too many graphs, but just to give you a context, you don't need to pay much attention to this one, except to realize that as we're going through an appropriation cycle on the Hill, at the exact same time on the exact same calendar, Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Interior are going through the next year. So they don't even know what they're getting in FY27 yet. They're already planning FY28 and in some cases FY29. So just to put it in context, there are multiple fiscal years happening at any given time. We focus on the appropriations and what's happening that will start allegedly October 1st for FY27. But at the same time, they're already formulating into the future. So if you as a friends group have some great ideas to maybe here's something we want to do in the next 3 years, 5 years, that could become an initiative that a lot of friends groups around the country could do, or a lot of refuges could do, be talking internally to your fish and wildlife contacts, refuge manager primarily, but also if you know regional folks, regional friends coordinator, people like that to say, hey, we're thinking into the future and this is what we see. So that's the only purpose of this slide. Not multiple things are happening at once, and it really doesn't make sense to be planning 1 or 2 years out when you don't even know what you're getting the particular year you're in. But that's the way this crazy process works. So now if you go to the next slide. So since 1997, as I mentioned, things have not worked correctly. But that baseline is the way it's supposed to work. And that baseline gives you that calendar, I hope, that helpful calendar base of how things don't work correctly. And you've heard of continuing resolutions, I'm sure. You'll hear about them this year. I just heard the final negotiations are already happening. We're not to October 1st yet. And they're already punting and saying, we're not going to get this done, forget about it. And they're talking about doing a continuing resolution till after the elections, till December 4th. And so it's becoming the norm. I still don't say that it's working correctly, but it's what has happened and continues to happen. And that's delay, punt, don't get all the bills passed by October 1st. But a continuing resolution is just a joint resolution of Congress that takes the temporary funding levels for all agencies and says you keep them exactly the same as last year. If you were in a corporation and your fiscal year was ending and you did not yet have a budget to vote on for the next fiscal year, you would say, okay, you would move that you pass a motion that you hold all funding levels the same until you have the ability to look at that next year's budget and vote on it. So it just holds everything at level funding until a regular appropriation is enacted. Now, there's a caveat to that. It's the federal government. We're talking trillions of dollars here, and many agencies and programs. You can't just say, okay, everybody stay the same. So what they do in a continuing resolution is they usually have a little section at the bottom that has some changes that absolutely have to happen for agencies to get their job done because you can't always just hold things static. But that's a continuing resolution. You'll hear about it. What happens after that is typically, and this is something you will have seen on the news or you will see on the news. All those 12 bills get lumped, and they get lumped into either an omnibus appropriation bill, which is all the appropriation bills pushed together into one bill that gets passed on an up or down vote. And this is where you'll see politicians on TV with a huge stack of papers on the dais next to them saying, nobody knows what's in this bill. There are 3,500 pages in this bill. Nobody knows what's in it. Fact is, staff and some members know exactly what's in it, but it makes for a good talking point. But it's not the way necessarily business is supposed to be done. If they don't do one huge omnibus appropriation for everything and all 12 bills, they'll do what we call mini buses. And mini buses are groups of bills that Congress thinks they can get passed, and it often leaves out one or two that there's no way you have the votes for. And so those sit out alone, often to become a year-long CR. Continuing resolutions are always done to a particular date and time. So it might be a 2-week CR. It might be a month-long CR. It might be till December 4th CR. It could be a year-long CR, which is where Congress really just punts its entire responsibility to do appropriation and says, well, just whatever was good last year, keep it going, same levels, no more, no less, unless we write it in the end as an anomaly. And I'm going to show you that. You haven't seen enough charts yet, so I'm going to show you more. If you go to the next slide. So essentially, the beginning of the process kind of stays the same. There's still the president's budget release. There's still the oversight hearings. There's still the markups. There's still, hopefully, in the House this year, there's only one, in the Senate, 0 bills on the floor that have been taken up. But then you get to where we're at now, which is the end of July. And this year, they're talking already about punting till December 4th, till after the election, so they can go home, they can leave DC and go campaign and do what they have to do. And they don't have to worry about getting the regular appropriations done in that time frame. And you'll hear this on the news. You'll hear short-term spending bill, short-term budget, stopgap spending, all to avoid a government shutdown. Sometimes there is a government shutdown and they play political games with that too. You know, sometimes it's definitive, sometimes, well, we found reserves in the Treasury, so it's going to last until, and that's all just normal for both parties. That's just normal. But a continuing resolution, if you look on the calendar there, it just basically puts things on hold until the end of the calendar year and into the next uh, calendar year. Quite often, my first year on appropriations, we passed the previous year's appropriation in March. And at the same time, we're dealing with the current year appropriation. So it can be quite complex. I hope I'm not confusing you. Um, every fiscal year from 1998 till now, there's been one or more CRs. And when they make the news, they don't often describe them correctly. Again, those are some of the terms they use, but it's all pointed at is the government shutting down or portions of the government shutting down. Um, or are they going to pass a full year CR and be done with it? So all of that is just the framework of how this process works. I know that was a lot. I hope it wasn't too confusing. And now I want to just quickly shift to, if you go to the next slide, to communicating with members of Congress about appropriations and other issues. Um, and then I want to leave hopefully plenty of time. I don't know what time it is for questions. So communicating with Congress, always make it a local message. All politics is local. Somebody said that a long time ago, and it still holds true, despite national news, despite social media, despite all of that. Politics is local. That member of Congress wants to know, how do I get reelected in my district? And that senator, how do I get reelected in my state? What can I do to benefit the constituents in my state or my district? That's it. And so key messages for friends groups and others is talk local. Talk about your refuge and what it means. And I put up here local economic impact, food, gas, lodging, property values. There's all the other kind of unmeasurable values of having a national wildlife refuge in your backyard. And Joan, did you want to mention the economic tool that is being, I don't think it's ready yet, but being developed
Yeah,
for
so
friends to use?
thanks to Mary Deschamps, we were in contact with a group called SEED, and they're an all-volunteer group. They are working with Corfa they've developed a tool for us to be able to put in information, and it spits out the economic value of various refuges. So we are currently in the process of testing that, and we will be looking for friends groups to do some additional testing of that so we can refine it and then hopefully get it out to all friends as quickly as possible. Turning it back to you, Greg.
Great. Now that's perfect because there's really nothing. Well, there are a lot of powerful things you can say to a member of Congress, but talking about local economies is at the core of what they're about because those are their voters. Those voters vote based upon the economy. When it all boils through all the other political stuff, it comes down to how am I doing? What's my bottom line? That's how I vote. And so, as friends groups and as people are trying to make sure refuges are funded as well as possible to the extent that they can help communities as much as possible, it comes down to what are those local economic impacts? What are the benefits to those voters, to the constituents? Health benefits, quality of life, education. How many trips from the local schools are we not going to do this year because we lost all our staff? So those kids for how many years are going to miss the opportunity to go out and touch nature and be a part of nature because our budget is gone? Quantify those and tell people about them. That's really important. And one of the ways you can do that, each member of Congress, they have specific hobbies, specific interests. In one instance, a member of Congress I work for is a big hunter and angler. And so you start talking to him about hunting and fishing, you have a captive audience immediately. And so equate that to how your refuge works. How many hunting opportunities, how many fishing opportunities, how many wildlife photography opportunities, which may not directly be hunting, but is a use of the direct use of wildlife on the landscape. And so having those kind of issues to communicate with members of Congress is vital. And friends groups, you guys can do that. I know you do it all the time. I'd love to just say do more, 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 but I also realize nobody has infinite time, um, and resources are limited. But having that kind of local key message to transmit to your local member of the House or your state senator or the senator for your state is important. Now, if you can go to the next slide, there's a next, yeah. Okay, so there's a way to magnify that. And I know friends groups are great at this. Um, I worked with friends groups that were great at this, and that is engaging key community members as a magnification to your message. So mayors and mayor offices, make sure they know what's happening on your refuge. Make sure they are encouraged to talk to the member of Congress or the senator about what's happening on the refuge. Um, Chambers of commerce are vital. Some of those businesses and some communities, and if you look at one of the points I try to make when I'm in a bigger discussion where all public lands are competing with each other, is look at the footprint of all the public land management agencies and look at the footprint of national wildlife refuges. National wildlife refuges are geographically distributed in this country so that they touch almost every single community. That's not the case with big national parks. You may have to drive 6 hours to get to one. You have a national wildlife refuge, most likely within an hour or less. So make sure your Chamber of Commerce recognizes that and knows the importance of that. Make sure county commissioners are involved, local community groups, etc. State legislatures, we tend to ignore the state legislatures, but they talk to the members of Congress a lot. And then back to the local teachers and youth, which is something that's kind of personal to me, is we've got to keep getting youth out onto these areas. And that all those things, all those engaging those key community members magnifies the message. And if you have a baseline of how the approach process works, a baseline of when to submit written testimony, when to call your members, when to say, hey, I saw this number in the House mark. I'm not sure that's enough. I'm not sure I like it. And you have all these people tuned into it too, and they may or may not weigh in. Hopefully they would, but they're at least tuned into what's happening. That then is just a magnifier and it becomes more powerful. So if we get to the next slide, you guys have listened to me too much here. So bottom line, know the basics of the timing of the budget process. I know it's complex. I know I showed you mind-numbing graphs of how it all works, and the process is extremely complex. It's crazy. But know the basics of it and the timing of when you need to be reaching out on specific appropriations issues. But the timing to reach out to members of Congress and their staff is all the time, anytime. Communicate with them, let them know what's going on. Like I said, don't be a total pest, be just this level below a total pest. Because honestly, in DC, the squeaky wheel does get the grease. It's the way it works. Get your community involved. You guys are friends groups. You already know this. I don't need to tell you this. I don't need to tell you the next one, which is make sure you communicate in a way that makes your refuge the center of the community, so that it's one of the centers of the community. I was born and raised in Roswell, New Mexico. What's Roswell about? Aliens, unfortunately. It's also about Bitter Lake National Wildlife Refuge, which has got the highest diversity of dragonfly species, I think, in the world, maybe just the US. But so those are two things you could automatically communicate. And every year now, the Friends group puts on a dragonfly festival in conjunction with the refuge. So that becomes one of the center pillars of that annual cycle of economic activity in Roswell, New Mexico. And it aligns with the Alien Festival because there's a lot of invasive species, aliens, on Bitter Lake, but also dragonflies, aliens. So just find unique and interesting ways to make your community, to make your refuge one of the centers of the community that those key influencers, those local constituents, key community members are talking about. So next slide. So I kind of feel like you guys are probably thinking this book would have been great if the author would have used different words in another order. Hopefully not entirely the case, but um, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I know that was a lot in a very short amount of time.
Oh, that's great, Greg. Thank you so much. Love those quotes. And let's see, Joan, do we have any questions that have been posted? I have a couple myself. But for example, first off, Greg, you talked about the importance of communicating with your local house and their staffers. And I know all house members are equal, but some are more equal than others. And if you have a house member who's lucky enough to be on one of the House appropriation committees, or especially the Interior appropriation committees, I suspect those people are really important. But besides those dozen or so members, do the staff from a non-interior appropriation subcommittee, do other House staff communicate with those professional staff in the Interior Appropes
Yes,
subcommittee?
they
Okay,
absolutely do,
okay,
especially if you give them a clear, compelling message about their, in the case of the House, the Senate, or I mean the district they're in. So that House district, if your refuge is in that district or in two districts, sometimes three, communicating specifics about that refuge and its importance, what it's got, how great it is, but what it's lacking because it doesn't have enough funding or enough staff or the potential to turn it into a absolute center for the entire community. Those are the things you communicate. They're all important. When I was at Sequoia National Wildlife Refuge, I went and I found, and the two senators' offices from Oklahoma weren't exactly, I think, overwhelmed with refuges at the time. We had both their staffs out. We gave them airboat rides. We showed them water, how we were managing water and impoundment so that in the fall, the waterfowl hunters from both Oklahoma and Arkansas, just no pun intended, but flocked to that refuge to hunt waterfowl. And just that little communication, having a staff member from a U.S. senator or a U.S. House member on the refuge experiencing something firsthand, touching the soil, turning a water control structure, getting a ride on an airboat. If you have an airboat, nobody ever says no to an airboat ride, by the way. But doing things like that, and it helped us. I don't know how much, but it helped us because that staff, then when some constituent calls on the phone and says, I hate this refuge, they're doing terrible things, that staffer and ultimately that member has an idea of, okay, well, I've been there. I didn't see anything that terrible happening. I saw benefits. I saw benefits to local community. I saw benefits to school groups. So demonstrating that to me is important. It's about kind of being a placeholder in the staff members and the congressional members' minds so that they're going to hear about your refuge. And it's probably going to not be good when they do, because most people don't call Congress to say everything's rosy. I love this place. They're calling because they think there's a problem. But you embed that in that staff and in congressional staff, the interesting thing is a lot of congressional staff, they work for one member, particular in DC. They don't leave DC. They work for another member and then another member and then another member. And so getting the baseline of planting those seeds is vital. And I know you guys are friends groups. You do this. I know you do this. Do it as much as possible. I've seen it at the refuges in New Mexico where I worked. I see Bosque del Apache. I love that place. Um, Worked there 2 summers for John Taylor. Um, but yeah, I mean, embedding positive messages or just messages about your refuge in those staffers and in those people is going to be hopefully somewhat of a buffer when they get the phone call that is somebody that really hates what's happening or thinks terrible, terrible things are happening because of this refuge. So,
Joan, any questions you're seeing?
Yeah, I see one from Steve. How does the budget reconciliation process fit into all of this? Greg just lost more hair. So,
oy, um, budget reconciliation is so complex. I don't even know how to answer that question. Even within DC, I would say within the committees of Congress and the staffers in Congress, I bet there's less than 20 people that really, really, really understand it. I have struggled to try to understand it. So I'm going to do what I never do and never try to do. I'm going to give you a non-answer that I think the best bet is to do as much as you can to promote your refuge, to be out front, to talk to folks, to talk to members, make your refuge the center of your community to the maximum extent possible. And if if there's a specific budget reconciliation issue, I can try to help you with that offline, but it's I hate not answering a question like that, but it's just tough. It is just so complex that again, most members of Congress, 90 plus percent members of Congress do not understand budget reconciliation.
we have an additional question. This one is from Sarah, who last month did a great webinar on the changes to the federal financial assistance that's being proposed. And
Yep.
Sarah's question is, are there any limits to communication with politicians that might border on lobbying above and beyond what we are allowed to do?
That is a great question. And the best answer for that question is when you're going to a member of Congress and you're talking about your refuge, you're educating, you're talking about what is actually happening. And in the instances where you go and you say, I think we need, more money. I think we need this much money, or we've lost staff. Where did our staff go? We need more staff. Unless under the lobbying rules in DC, unless you spend a specific amount of time and you're paid and you're registered as a lobbyist, there's a lot of steps that have to happen. You're not really lobbying. You're just educating. You're stating facts about what's happening on your refuge. And then as a private citizen, you're saying, I think we need more. I think, we cannot keep operating if every year the staff goes down by three, and now we're -3 because we're complexed with a refuge that's 300 miles away. So we have no staff. We that to me is not lobbying, and I don't think legally that meets the definition of lobbying. But that's a great question, and I mean, when in doubt, consult. Um, if you're really, really worried about it, consult if your friends group has a lawyer, maybe call NWRA, call us, and let our lawyers figure it out. Shampa is the lead counsel for NWRA now, and she's great. She'll be able to give you a pretty quick answer on that if lawyers can give pretty quick answers.
I
But
will add, Greg, if I could add, there are a
yes,
couple of good resources in the Corfa website on the difference between lobbying and just being an advocate. And very rarely are we doing very much lobbying.
right.
We're being mostly an advocate for specific things or for general things. So take a look at that, Sarah. It's some good kind of graphs that show yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And you're going to end up in the advocate slot, most likely. There are
Yeah,
some
and
times, yeah, but go ahead.
well, when in doubt, I mean, if you get your community involved, if you get the mayor's office and the chamber and your county commissioners, and most of them have registered lobbyists somewhere. Not all, but a lot of them do. Let them do the lobbying. If you have something that specifically comes out as that, asking that question or asking for that would be lobbying. That's where, if you have the community on your side, you have that many more resources to go to and to talk with and to say, hey, look at the amount of economic loss the community of Roswell, New Mexico is having because we have lost every every staff member on that National Wildlife Refuge except the one that the Refuge Association is paying for, which is almost the case right now at Bitter Lake. I think they're down to just an acting coming through now and then. So I don't know that for a fact. Don't quote me, but it's that way on so many refuges. And even before, not to go too far off track, but even before that, there's always been over 200 refuges that never, ever had any staff at all. Some of them don't even have signs up on the lands they take care of. So,
Greg, you talked about the formulation side of the budget and then the execution side. And the
yep.
execution is when once the money comes to headquarters, it gets sent out to the regions and then to the field stations. And you didn't talk about that at all. And that's not really a political process, although sometimes it is. And friends are sometimes curious about, well, can they influence that side of the funding? Once it's hit headquarters and comes out to the regions and then to the field stations, is that a time they can influence? And should they?
So it's possible. So what happens on the execution side is so Treasury goes through this whole process. Once an appropriation is passed, they go through this whole process of how money gets down to different org numbers. So, each account, each refuge has the accounts and sub accounts, and it gets fairly complex. But there is the possibility of some influence because some regions and some regional directors or some regional refuge chiefs may have a little bit of discretion in how that money gets spent. But for the most part, put your time, put your time up front to just grow the number for all refuges. Talk to that member about your specific refuges, why it's important, why that top line number needs to be big enough that it can help everybody. When you can influence on the execution side, but it's minimal and it's extremely complex, and you have to know exactly, precisely what you're
And the money
asking.
will be coming from some other station. So you don't want to do that.
Well, that happens, but
Yeah. I
again,
have
that's
one more question if Joan, if there are no more, and it has to do with kind of earmarks,
hmm.
which I believe in the last year or two, there has been an opportunity for each Congress member to have a community project funding where they will accept requests for specific projects within their district. But I don't know if that's something friends groups should spend time looking at, how much money or how successful that is. That's called the community project funding.
Yes, and that is what earmarks are called now. So just quick history, earmarks at one point were anywhere, anytime. And this is a classic example of the Washington pendulum. Washington's a pendulum, it goes back and forth. So earmarks were out of control. Oh, ban them. So we're now on this side of the pendulum. Then we let it go. It started to get out of control again. Nope, ban them. And now we're kind of settled in this community project funding phase. What I would say is if you have a very specific construction project or similar large dollar, like moving dirt, expanding management capability on the river, something like that, it'd be worth asking the congressional staff about to say, hey, we're thinking of this as a possible community project. And the House and the Senate had different names for these things, and I can't keep them straight. So make sure, depending on the staffer you're talking to, make sure you have the right nomenclature. But um, it's going to be rare. And in the interior environment bill, they have restricted the different accounts. So really, one of the only places you can ask for those now is within EPA and wastewater infrastructure.
Okay.
So they may have a handful of construction projects on public lands accounts, but look at the interior bill and see for that particular year, where are they allowing earmarks? Or sorry, community-based projects, what do they call them? And it again, that'll vary, and who knows, in the next Congress, it might swing back to where they want to earmark everything. Every account is open. That hasn't been that way for quite some time, but again, Washington's a pendulum. It goes back and forth, and you know, yeah. I mean, you just need to feel it out. I think I wish there was a lot more room for construction projects on national wildlife refuges. Not necessarily new visitor centers, which everybody wants, but big natural resource based wildlife habitat enhancement projects. And the construction budget for Fish and Wildlife Service has always been completely dismal compared to the other land management agencies. And I don't see that changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
I, Joan, do we have any more questions or anyone still on want to raise their hand and ask a question? Otherwise, yep. Okay. Joan.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
All right, I'm going to give you an anecdote about getting in touch with your house member.
yes,
Our house member is less than 10 miles from our refuge.
yep.
We sent out two nice letters, one to his Washington office, one to his Patchogue office. They lost both of them. We then sent another letter making them sign for it. And all we asked was, why don't you or some of your staff come down and see what it is your constituents are enjoying? Haven't heard from them yet.
And you know that this is another one. There's not an easy answer for that. Some members are not responsive. Most of them are, but not all. Some of them just don't see that as an important thing to do. I mean, I might actually, and I'm sure you did, you know, call a specific staff member on the phone and say, "Hey, here's where we're at. Here's what we're doing. We were thinking of sending you an invitation to come down and visit. Want to flesh it out with you first, see what you might be interested in." And I'm sure you've done that.
Oh, yeah.
Fringe
Well,
groups are so smart, but if
we had called to say, gee, you haven't even acknowledged. And it was like, oh no, we didn't get neither of them. So we rewrote the letter, included in the original letter, some information about the refuge. And that's all we said is that when you get a chance, you staff, why don't you come down just to see what it is that your constituents are enjoying?
and
Hopefully
there
someday.
hopefully someday, I agree, and keep at it. You know, a steady drop of water can wear away a rock.
Mhm.
So just keep at it. But some member offices that's just not the way that member is tuned, and therefore their staff is not tuned that way. Now, send letters certainly, but call on the phone and talk to actual staffers and even ask for a chief of staff for that particular office and talk to them and don't make it, oh, we've tried to reach out to you and you guys have ignored us. Be like, hey, we are so excited. We just want you guys
Come and see. Yes.
to
Oh, we're losing you.
show you the things we're doing. And because there's offices that have the are open and file letters and saying, which pile do I put it in? Not what does it actually mean? But I say keep at it. Just, you know,
Yeah, we do. When we
I,
have a
I get what you're saying. Some are going to respond. I think the majority will eventually.
Yeah.
I didn't, yeah, I didn't hear that. I think my internet cut out.
Yeah, you got frozen for a few seconds there. Like I say, I mean, we were polite. We sent them some brochures and some information and, please come. And what the next time we have an event, we will send another invitation. Like I said, just, it's in your backyard. Come and see what your people are talking about. We're a complex. We're not just one refuge. We have 5 staff members who run from Lido Beach to Montauk Point on Long Island. Joan knows. And
Yep.
we have 2 others that are open to the public. One of them is in a ritzy area, and sometimes we get a little help from them.
Well, I would say why don't see if you can get the mayor or mayor's office or chamber, one of these other local groups to say, hey, you let them reach out and say you need to come see what we're
Come and
doing.
see what we're doing.
Mhm.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank
Mhm.
you.
Thank you.
Great program.
We got an interesting note from Cindy at Friends of Hackmatack, and they did apply for and get $1 million community funding project. So
Wow,
there's a nice little reference there. Congrats to Cindy and their
that's
group.
awesome.
Um, if there are no more questions, I just have one or two more quick announcements. Anybody else, though? Well, we've got the budget man.
I'm
So
not
So,
can I just
seeing
close and
anything else.
say
yeah, go ahead. Absolutely,
I
Greg.
absolutely appreciate what you guys are doing for refuges as a former refuge staffer. I mean, it just is, to me, it's mind-boggling that so many people locally get behind their national wildlife refuges and believe at their core what those refuges are about and what they do. So I appreciate it. Keep it up, double down, triple down if you've got the membership and the time. Don't give up. I just said it, a steady drop of water can wear away a rock. So don't give up.
Thank you for that, Greg. Couple of quick announcements. July 28th, next Tuesday, is the next Friends Share call. This is the more informal get together that Friends members have. And we're going to be talking about newsletters. How effective are they? How people approach their production and distribution. August 18th is the next webinar that's scheduled, and that's going to be about artificial intelligence and how friends groups can make use of different AI tools. And I know some are out there doing it quite a bit with grant writing and other kinds of management activities, but I think that's going to be an interesting topic. September, we have a couple of things that are being cooked on right now, haven't locked them in place. One will be a deeper dive into how friends manage volunteers versus service volunteers versus interns, who does what, who's responsible for what. And then there's another possible topic that we're trying to figure out. So more to come on the September webinar. Again, if anybody has ideas or thoughts about what subjects they'd like to hear, you know how to reach us, either the Refuge Association or Corfa. Any one of us would be happy to. So with that, Joan, I think, did I miss any stuff we
I
want to
think
talk?
you covered everything, Tom.
Okay.
And thank you everyone for attending. Greg, thank you. This
Yeah,
was
thank
a
you, Greg.
very
Good.
comprehensive presentation.
Awesome.
Happy to do it.
Thanks very much. Bye, everybody.